Welcome back to Archaeology After Dark, everybody. I am, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes. My guest today is Jeremy French. Jeremy, thanks for being here.
Awesome. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Jeremy French. I am a grassland ecologist for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute that is based out of APSU University. We cover the entire Southeast. I personally am an ecologist that covers northern Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, southern Indiana, and southern Ohio and southern Illinois.
So, that brings us to what we're talking about today. I think a lot of people, this is an issue that a lot of people think about, especially when they work outdoors, is the impact we have on the environment. And archaeology is no exception. We do a lot of impact on the environment. So, Jeremy, when people think about grasslands, especially here in Alabama and the Southeast, what areas of the states do you associate with it?
Yeah, so I guess that's a little bit of a tough question to answer, um, because primarily large portions of the Southeast were historically grasslands. Now, there's certain areas that we are almost like the charismatic megafauna of grasslands, like in Alabama, you have the Black Belt Prairie. But the Black Belt Prairie wasn't the only grassland in Alabama. It's just kind of the most notable one or the most known one. Surrounding the Black Belt Prairie in Alabama would have been hundreds and thousands of acres of shortleaf pine and oak savannas. Or, we can talk about the pennyroyal karst plain that was millions of acres of treeless prairie. Well, not only was that a grassland, but all the surrounding area of that would have also been savanna. Or you come into Tennessee and we have these areas like the Nashville Basin, which had large glade complexes. The glades themselves weren't the only grasslands there, but they were surrounded by grasslands as well. So I could safely say that probably the most predominant ecosystem in the Southeast would have been some sort of grassland. What exactly did that look like? It varies, from location to location. There's all different types of grasslands that we had in the Southeast. So we had things like, longleaf pine savannas in the coastal plain, shortleaf pine oak savannas, glades, fens, bogs, river scour, um, uh, cane breaks, prairies, barrens. There's so many out there that all together they would have made up this vast, grassland systems that would have had this mosaic all across the Southeast. Now we definitely had, true forests, and we definitely had some old growth forests, but it isn't until the past 5-10 years that SGI has been on the cutting edge of looking at the not only the science and the mapping of this, but really deep diving into the cultural history and the historic sites, and looking at pre-settlement maps, the first people who were mapping North America, as well as diving into those cultural resources and looking at things like we have sites in Alabama where in cave systems where they have prairie chicken bones, and that tells us something about what Alabama was like a couple hundred years ago. Prairie chickens are a grassland species. They actually require large expanses of treeless grassland. So when we look at like Alabama now in today's landscape, we don't have large scale grasslands in Alabama, but they were there, and they're what we would consider an endangered ecosystem. So grasslands across the Southeast, um, really only about 2 to 5% of what historically belonged there, that native ecosystem, still exists. We're talking about 95 to 98% habitat loss um, in the past couple hundred years.
So, what are the major factors that contribute to that habitat loss other than the man made ones like man?
So a lot of them are man, so a good example of that is agriculture, right? So when we were settling the West, essentially, for a long time, Alabama and Tennessee was the West. The first grounds that got turned into croplands were our grasslands because one, you didn't have to have, a huge deforestation campaign to plant crops. They were already in a croppable system and they had the most nutrient rich soil. So as settlers came west, they got settled before we can study them. So that was one of the first impacts. Another large impact is we removed fire from the landscape. So we know that culturally these areas burned very often, but also naturally they burned very often. And what I mean by that is that the Native Americans that were here long before us, they burned these areas regularly. They burned them to keep up, maintain good hunting grounds. They burned them, to also produce their own source of crops. And also there was a lot of natural fire. So most systems, depending where you are, probably burned, somewhere in the every 2 to 4 years at varying degrees of intensity. So we cropped a lot of it, and then we stopped fire, which are our two big ones. So without a fire on the landscape, these ecosystems at times can't persist because they get encroached on by trees. So a lot of our savannas, which is a treed grassland, um, succeeded to kind of what we'd call a second growth forest. So a very kind of unhealthy type forest, lacking fire. It has a very low quality of tree species in there at times, and then our grasslands were converted. We also see a high level of those grasslands because they were settled so early on. Um, they've been the ones developed. A good example of that is Nashville. So, like Nashville, sitting on the Cumberland River, the site of where the Titans play. I think it's called like Music Life Stadium or something like that. It's actually a historic salt lick. It's called French's Lick, which I am very endeared towards because my last name's French. But you can talk about, even up into like the 1700s, there being herds of bison in the Nashville Basin, herds of elk using those salt licks, and really herds of bison all throughout the Southeast. So we developed these grasslands as well, like Nashville, or and so obviously grasslands can't persist in development either. So there's so many things hitting this habitat type at the same time that steeps so deep into how we settled this country, but also, man, we've lost so much cultural history there because these grasslands were primarily already being degraded before, we could really document them. Um, we have to dive deep and we have to kind of do things on the cutting edge of science with mapping and research to really locate these grasslands and like oftentimes we're looking at maps from the 1600s of French explorers, or we're looking at a big thing that we look at is like Gray's fossil site out in Eastern Tennessee to try and get an idea of what these habitats were like, in the Miocene and the Pleistocene, and use that to try and infer what they should be like today. It's tough, but it's also very fun and exciting because we're always discovering new things. I can think about like a week or two ago, one of one of the students from the university brought in this map and was like, "Oh, look, my friend brought me this map," and we were looking at it, and mapped in an area that we hadn't seen before was, this is probably like a French explorer's map with Savannah in an area we hadn't considered before. But we were able to look at that map and say, oh, wow, that's a clue. Let's start digging into that clue. So it's really fun because we're on the cutting edge of the science. We're always discovering new things, and but it's also very hard and stressful at times because we are fighting for quite literally an endangered ecosystem. And fighting for an endangered ecosystem is different than fighting for an endangered animal. Anybody, you take any, house mom or person out of Nashville or any big city, and you show them an endangered animal. You show them a rhino or an elephant or a hellbender salamander, and they're like, "Oh my God, that is the coolest thing ever! I want to protect that." It's easy to build that interest there. When we're talking about grasslands as an endangered ecosystem, it's much harder because people have to be a lot more bought in, and it's a not a harder sell, but it's harder to say, hey, we used to have a million plus contiguous acres of prairie in northern Tennessee and Kentucky, and there's only 2% left. It kind of breaks your brain. But then you think about how like Audubon wrote when he was in southern Kentucky and north middle Tennessee, he talked about shooting so many prairie chickens in a day that he just had his fill and he had to leave them lie. Or you think about how there's been dermatid lizards uncovered at Gray's fossil site, from like the Miocene. These areas that we've lost in the past 300 years or 3 to 500 years, they've been grasslands probably since the Miocene, and like that really, and so like when people are like, oh, I often hear the argument of, oh, well, they're gone now. Why should we put them back? Or you're just picking a time and space to say, oh, that's what this should be. It's like, no, this has been this way since the Miocene. We've just recently, in the past 3 to 500 years, destroyed this ecosystem. And like, uh, even like newer on the scale, you talk about Cornell Lab of Ornithology came out 3 years ago with a paper that shows grassland birds as a whole, just since 1970, have declined by 50%. They've lost over 700 million individuals as a population in the United States. Like that is like astronomical, like the prairies are burning in front of our face, and it's sometimes hard to communicate because people just tend to think of the Southeast as this giant conglomerate of forests, and it was so much more diverse than that, and so much more beautiful and complex and cooler than just trees.
Yeah, that's something I think we have in common is we have to, as especially archaeologists and historians, when we go out to a historic site, we can't, see it as it was. We have to imagine it or, use science and maps and things like that to put the pieces together to actually see what, say, like an occupational frontier fort or something looked like at the time.
Hey, I apologize. Your audio just cut out, but I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry, it happens. So, a little technical issue, folks. We're getting back into it. So what exactly does the Southeastern Grassland Institute do, like on a day-to-day basis?
That is a wonderful question. One of the reasons I think that I have the greatest job in the world is because one, I'm very ADHD and no 2 days are alike for me. So I get to switch around quite a bit. We do a lot of research, so we do a lot of ecological and botanic research. Me personally, I do a lot of like invertebrate research and botanic research, but we also do a lot of restoration and education and outreach. So no day looks the same for me. Some days I'll be writing a grant to try and help restore, an endangered ecosystem. Some days I might be giving a presentation, and some days I'm in the field doing actual on the ground research.
So you're not in the field every day.
No, no, unfortunately not. I wish I wish I could be. That's definitely my favorite part of the field. But I would say in the field season, so like March through winter for us, which might October, I'm probably in the field 3 or 4 times a week. Whereas like in the off season, I'm in the office quite a bit, prepping for, field techs and the field season for the following year, trying to get plans together because once the field season hits, it's pretty much a sprint. We're working all day, every day.
Yeah, as soon as the weather becomes tolerable for archaeologists too, we are out every day we can, rain or shine most days.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here. As soon as weather, things start greening up. I know I was down in Alabama a few weeks ago and it was already greening up down there. So as soon as, we start getting green up, we're pretty much in the field, 40 hours a week. And just trying to keep up with needs. And that's a mix of doing research. I do a lot of prescribed fire as a restoration practice. I do a lot of restoration work. Um, I try to honestly schedule myself at least one office day a week so that my paperwork doesn't fall behind or my data doesn't fall behind, but it doesn't always work that way.
Yeah, I know the feeling. As soon as I have a fun day in the field, I just know in a week or so somebody's going to want my report on what I did that day, so I can get justified in being paid for what I did.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
It's all about the paycheck, you know. I mean, yeah, we're helping the environment and learning about history, but it's also so we can get paid.
Yeah, I definitely have to make a living for sure.
So, you work in the southeastern region of the United States. What areas are you fondest of? I mean, grasslands, you know, I know you're pretty attached to that, but like regions of states, what are your some of your favorites?
Oh man, that's a good question. Um, so one, I have to preface this. I grew up in South Florida. I grew up in the Everglades, fishing in the ocean. So I am infatuated with like the coastal North and South Carolina. Um, I'm infatuated with like the Black Belt of Alabama because there's a very deep cultural history down there. One of my favorite projects that we work on is down in the Black Belt. And then I would say probably the Nashville Basin as well. The like glades are incredibly complex and interesting ecosystems, and they're so different from anything else that I've ever worked in. Before I moved to Tennessee, I was living in Wyoming, and before that, I lived and worked in the tall grass prairies in Iowa. So to come from that school of thought and see these exceedingly unique grasslands with with so many endemics right in the Nashville Basin, which is like surrounded by development, and like you can go from being in a housing development and step off into the woods, into the glades, and you've got things like Tennessee coneflower that's an endemic. You've got, you know, Dahlia foliosa, which is a endangered plant species. You've got streamside salamanders, which is a state endangered salamander species, and just like the overall biodiversity, it just kind of blows my mind. I've loved moving to the southeast because overall the biodiversity out here is just crazy. But if I had to pick my three favorite spots, it would definitely be the Black Belt Prairie of Alabama, coastal Carolinas, or the Nashville Basin.
So I've got a fondness for the Black Belt Prairie myself. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of West Alabama. Don't ever say I didn't do anything for you guys, plugging the university. So I worked at the Natural History Museum in Livingston, and we spent a lot of time out on the chalk bluffs on the Tombigbee River, looking at just about every kind of creature that lives in the county.
Yeah, those chalk bluffs are super cool. They are really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I remember one day we were out on a site, and the director of the museum said, "Hold this," and then jumped over a cliff so he could look at the cliffs. It was my
One of my
first week.
favorite
It was my first week there, and it scared me to death.
that's super funny. One of my favorite things about living in the Southeast too is like the ability to just go into pretty much any creek and find Cretaceous age fossils is like super cool to me. Um, I love like I'm a rock hound. I'm always walking creeks. I'm always looking, for fossils and stuff like that. And we just have some of the coolest stuff. On this property that we have a project on in the Black Belt of Alabama, one day, one of our biologists just stumbled upon a mosasaur eroding out of this chalk bluff, and it's not something that's it's not deemed like museum worthy because it was so degraded. But just to be there and like see that and like it, I'm very infatuated with the southeast.
Yeah, that's a fun thing about studying. You mentioned the culture of the Black Belt is so in parts of Alabama, people actually used to use Basilosaurus fossils to prop up their houses, like the spinal vertebra, especially. This is like I'd say mid to early 1800s. It's a fossil whale for those of you who don't know what that one is.
That's awesome. And there's such a rich bed of culture there in the Black Belt, and some of it's not pretty. It's not a pretty history, um, but it's so important to knowing who we are, and it's important to understand that the Black Belt. was this amazing, amazing place before we lost most of it. And there's some pieces too that are still intact. But you talk about quite literally prairie chickens in Alabama. That's where they were. They were in the Black Belt, and or bison in Alabama. Like you talk about blowing someone's mind. We had large herds of bison in the southeast, and most people can't even picture that. And that was like a staple source. The prairie chickens were a staple for Native American tribes. So that tells us, tells me as an ecologist, that not only were they here, they were thriving here. They were doing very well, and that allows us to deduce what the habitat was like. It was those prairies.
Yeah, it this is something I have to talk to people about just about on a daily basis is 35 million years ago the entire state of Alabama was underwater. And it blows people's minds that they can walk, down a creek outside of, a major city here in Alabama and find like a fossilized shark tooth.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And what's interesting to me too, is we can draw that conclusion botanically as well. So if you look at like botanic species in the tip of Florida, like the southern tip of Florida, we can essentially at times draw a line to the same species in the tip of Texas. Now, those species may not occur anywhere else. And then you think about, hey, well, how did those species get there? They're the same species. Obviously they're genetically somewhat distinct because they've been, separated for so long, but they're the same species. What happened? A long time ago, Alabama was covered in water, but also there was a time period where the shore, the water line was a lot further out. So we've lost quite a bit of shoreline that would have extended out deeper into the ocean that would have held, and connected grassland corridors from Florida to Texas.
Yeah, and that's, something that people really enjoy hearing, especially when they come, people who aren't actually from the Southeast, they come and they hear about stuff like that. And they're like, we don't have stuff like that up in the Northeast or out West. We have like this and this and this. And I was like, well, we have, land sharks.
Yeah, at least out west and in the Midwest, they were all glaciated, so you get cool like glaciated rocks and stuff like that. But
So you're an ecologist. What exactly does that mean?
that means that I study an entire ecosystem essentially. Like, I don't specialize in any one specific animal or plant within that ecosystem. I incorporate all that into what I do. So like that means that I've got to know the birds and the bees and the plants and the geology to some extent and really try and encompass what that is. Now, if you were to like drop down and try and specify what type of like ecologist I am, I would probably fall under a restoration ecologist because a lot of my time is spent restoring ecosystems. So I understand the processes to not only identify and understand these systems, but also restore these systems when they've been degraded.
So I imagine that anytime you propose restoring an ecosystem, it's a timely process. Like you can't just do it overnight. Like it's months and years time to actually restore it to what you ideally want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And it depends on the situation and the barrier because some of these systems, so we have what's called grassland remnants. And a grassland remnant is essentially an undisturbed, uncropped, untilled grassland remnant that still exists. Most of the remnants we find, they're sub 5 acres, right? They're very small pieces of land. In those remnants, sometimes they can be somewhat pristine, and all they need is fire returned to them, right? We just need to start burning them. A lot of our savanna remnants have just succeeded to forests, and they need burning and thinning. So some of them it could be a relatively easy process where we're just reintroducing that natural fire, and maybe we're doing some thinning. Other times, I do a lot of like a crop field restoration at times. And in that situation, I'll never be as good as evolution. I don't have, a couple of million years of evolution in my pocket. But we're trying to at least make it functional, right? We're trying to make it habitable for grassland species. And that can be a very long process. It can be 5 years before we get it to a point where it's at least decent, but it's going to be continued on. If you give me a crop field, I can get it pretty decent in 2 or 3 years, to at least have some speciation, and usability to pollinators and grassland birds and stuff like that. But for it ever to be compared to like a remnant that has, maybe 400 species in a very short, like 400 plant species in a very confined area, it'd take a long time, a very long time.
So I imagine when you're monitoring these sites and places over that period of time, when you see like certain species of birds, fish, frogs, or whatever come back to it, it's a sign that it's getting healthier.
For sure, for sure. We definitely have those storyteller species, and sometimes that means focusing on plants coming back to those systems. What a lot of people don't realize is that, unfortunately, not often enough, but sometimes the case may be that your seed bank or your root stock may still be somewhat intact. So if we can revitalize that, we can see plants return to a site that maybe haven't been seen there in decades. Um, Now, that's not always the case, but it's the best case scenario. A lot of these plants in these grassland systems, these flowers, these forbs, they can maybe they're long-lived perennials. They maybe could be 100 years old. Um, and that's hard to really picture when you're looking at maybe a 5 foot plant versus compared to like, a huge giant oak tree that's a similar age. But these plants, you can have a root system that reaches 10 feet down, into the earth, and they can be very long-lived perennials. Now, what that allows us to do is sometimes we have sites, like a good example of this is the Cumberland Plateau, um, or the plateau here in Tennessee, where that used to all historically be savanna, right? It would have been post oak and shortleaf pine savanna. A lot of it has seceded to forest, so it's no longer in a savanna state. But if we go back into those systems and return fire and remove some of the undesirable trees, we see the rootstock respond with exceedingly rare plants, like rare orchids, and things that we haven't seen at those sites. And if we can, tag that up with seeing, some grassland birds return to a site, or, some invertebrates like American bumblebees, or monarchs, or any of these things that are grassland, kind of endemic, um, or grassland obligates is a better term, then we can say, yeah, that site is becoming more healthy. One of the biggest like wins, in Tennessee in the past 50, 60 years is out on the plateau. There's a WMA in Tennessee called Bridgestone Firestone WMA. And years ago, they just, kind of accidentally started restoring savanna, and we're talking 20 years ago. And now you go there and they have this gorgeous savanna that's filled with species that you couldn't even imagine seeing elsewhere. And they did the same thing on the plateau at a place called Catoosa Wildlife Management Area in Tennessee. And an entomologist from Mississippi State came up, his name's Jovan Hill, and standing in the Catoosa savanna, he regarded it as the most alive place he'd ever been in the world, because it was so alive with invertebrates and flowers. And these grassland systems are the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet.
Yeah, and this, folks, is why Jeremy and I love working in the Southeast. We don't get stuff like this. I mean, we could get stuff like this, but it wouldn't be the same as it is here. Like, if you've never been to the Southeastern United States, I sincerely hope you do come for a visit.
Oh yeah, man. Come to the salamander capital of the world here in Tennessee. It's crazy biodiverse, and you gotta like your field guides too, because you're gonna learn some stuff, because you're gonna see some stuff you haven't seen before.
So, Jeremy, I usually close out episodes with career advice or research advice to people who are interested in the topic. So, say somebody wanted to learn more about the Southeastern Grasslands Institute or ecology, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, so the number one advice would be, seek me out for sure. I'm always advising people. I get Instagram messages or Facebook messages all the time of prospective students saying, hey, what should I be focusing on? And then the Southeastern Grasslands Institute Facebook and website is phenomenal. It's full of resources. Um, and obviously our contact information there as well. And then ultimately, the biggest advice I can give to somebody who's interested in wildlife or interested in conservation in general is going to be to learn your plants and your geology. Um, an advisor of mine once said to me, and this was when I first came into my career field, I wasn't a plant guy, I wasn't a botanist, I wasn't an ecologist. I just really love snakes and turtles, man. And he would always make me do all these vegetation surveys when I was doing research. And like you'd be out there, it's 95 degrees, and you're just sweating and pouring and dying. And one day I got to complaining, like young undergrads do. And he looked at me, he goes, now, Jeremy, if you don't know plants, you don't know Jack. Because if you don't know plants, you'll never know the animals. Because if you don't know anything about their habitat, you just don't know it. And I take that a step forward. If you don't know the geology that sets the bedrock for what the plants are and how they evolved, then you really don't understand these systems. So get a field guide, learn some plants, learn some geology. And if you've got any questions, reach out to SGI, Southeastern Grasslands Institute, on Facebook or their website, or reach out to me, Jeremy French, on any social media also, and I'll be glad to help out.
Jeremy, that's going to wrap us up for today. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you for having me.